What's up, my comic comrades? As I'm sure many of you are aware that the New Mutants movie has been delayed more times than I can even count, but it's finally going to see the light of day, which I couldn't be more excited for. Now, admittedly, I am not the biggest New Mutants fan, but this movie does look really good, and I like how it's taking the superhero genre and putting a horror twist on it. I just really want this movie to succeed because A, I love comic book movies and I want them all to do well, but B, this movie has gone through so much over the last few years that it would be awesome for this movie to be really well received and successful. And speaking of wanting comic book movies to be successful, this past weekend DC fandom gave us a massive sneak peek at the future of the DC cinematic universe and pretty much broke the internet. The Batman was without question the highlight, but we also got the epic teaser for the upcoming Snyder Cut, which gave us the first real look at Darkseid, not to mention an incredible look at the direction DC is headed with Black Adam, including the official announcement of the JSA appearing in the film. Dr. Fate, anyone? It was a ridiculously awesome event that left us even more optimistic about the future of the DC cinematic world. There was a lot more that came out of the day, and believe me when I tell you, we had a lot to say about it. You can actually find our live reaction thoughts on the Variant Instagram at @variant_official. And Tim and I broke down our thoughts on absolutely everything in yesterday's podcast, which you can find right here. And if you haven't already subscribed to our podcast, we'd appreciate you clicking that sub button while you're there. Also, if you like what we're putting out there, give the podcast a 5-star review as it helps us out with the algorithm. But with that side note, let's get back to the main topic. Anyway, since the New Mutants movie is finally upon us, today you guys get a history of New Mutants episodes. So let's see what the New Mutants are all about in the place that started it all and matters the most, the comic books. The New Mutants team was created by Chris Claremont and Bob McLeod. They first appeared in Marvel graphic novel The New Mutants issue 4 in September of 1982. Because of how successful the X-Men were in the 1980s, Marvel Comics was like, hey, you know what? We're gonna publish our first spin-off team inspired by the X-Men. So that's exactly what they did, hiring famed X-Men writer Chris Claremont and artist Bob McLeod. Together, the two came up with the original 5 students that made up the New Mutants team. Together, Chris and Bob, alongside inker Chris Gustovich, were responsible for the first 5 issues of the ongoing New Mutants title in 1983. But now that you got briefed with a little real-world history of how and why the New Mutants were created, let's take a look at their comic book origin. As I said earlier, the X-Men were extremely popular in the 1980s. Some would even say this was the peak of their popularity, which is a hell of a statement considering they were extremely popular in other decades as well, such as the 90s. I mean, hello, the 90s X-Men animated series, anybody? And Jim Lee's X-Men? Issue 1 of Jim Lee's X-Men is still the #1 selling comic book of all time. Anyway, I digress. The point is the X-Men were extremely popular in the 1980s. And because Marvel is a business, they were like, hey, we need to make another X-Men book and team because that means money. Enter the New Mutants. Basically, how they went about creating this team within the Marvel continuity was having Charles Xavier, the creator of the X-Men, become increasingly worried after losing several members of the X-Men. You gotta remember, around this time is when Thunderbird died on his second mission, and then Jean Grey, aka the Phoenix, committed suicide. And that's not even the kicker. Then, in an attack by the Brood, Xavier thought that all the X-Men had died. So needless to say, Charles, being the father figure of the team, was like, crap, all of my children have died, which caused him to sink into a deep depression and vow to never put any young mutant in harm's way again. But as we know, that didn't last long because his friend Moira McTaggart was finally able to convince him to reopen his school to help young mutants. She was able to convince Xavier after receiving a letter from Mr. Fantastic regarding a mutant named Cheyenne, who later became Karma. At the time, Karma needed help controlling her powers, and this girl's alternative at the time was joining the Hellfire Club or Magneto. Needless to say, Professor X would train her along with some other kids, but he would only train them on how to use their special powers and not in ways of combat to fight in the field. Moira would later encounter a girl named Rain Sinclair, who had been shot and has the ability of turning into a wolf, or as you probably know her, Wolfsbane. Ultimately, Moira would become Rain's guardian and took her to the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. It's here she would meet Karma, who, as I just mentioned, also just arrived at the school. And I didn't mention it earlier, but Karma's powers is the ability to possess minds and process the emotions of people and animals. Shortly after the two new girls settle into Xavier's school, he gets a letter from longtime friend Black Eagle, aka Sebastian Shaw. He asked Xavier if he would take in his granddaughter Danielle Moonstar, aka Psyche, as a student and teach her how to use her ever-growing mutant powers. Danielle Moonstar has the ability of being able to pull images of fear or desire from her victims and manifest them as 3-dimensional illusions. Yeah. Talk about a mind F. Anyway, of course, Xavier goes to meet Black Eagle's granddaughter immediately, and he also brought with him his 2 current students, Karma and Wolfsbane. However, when they get there, they find out that Black Eagle has been murdered by the hands of Donald Pierce, who has been an X-Men villain for a very long time and is a former member of the Hellfire Club's inner circle. Because of this, Danielle Moonstar agrees to go with Xavier per her grandfather's wishes, but she really agreed because she intended to track down Pierce and make him pay for what he did to her grandfather. Along the way, Xavier and gang find yet another young mutant who's been attacked by Pierce, named Roberto da Costa, aka Sunspot. Sunspot has the power of super strength, which is fueled by the sun. Yes, I know that is very similar to Superman, but hey, what are you gonna do? Eventually, Pierce tries to kill Sunspot, but Sunspot's girlfriend takes the bullet for him. Then after, he joins Xavier's team of young mutants who are all out to get revenge on Pierce. They track Pierce down to his headquarters, and once they arrive, get into a fight with Pierce's mercenary squad. But of course, they defeat them. But one of Pierce's mercenaries is Samuel Guthrie, aka Cannonball, who was a hired mutant by Pierce to attack Xavier and his team. At one point, Pierce tells Cannonball to kill Xavier, but he refuses. So in the end, Xavier is able to defeat Pierce with his mental powers. Then Xavier invites Sam to attend his school. And wouldn't you know it, a couple of weeks later, Sam showed up and accepts his offer. And thus, the New Mutants were born. And just like that, my comic comrades, we have the origin and original New Mutants team, which consists of Karma, Psyche, who later goes by the name Mirage, Wolfsbane, Sunspot, and Cannonball. But now, you know what time it is for story arcs and publication history. Let's dive right in. The New Mutants team was originally meant to debut in their own self-titled series. But then last minute, then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter made the call for the New Mutants to be reworked into a graphic novel purely so that the Marvel graphic novel could make its deadline for the next issue. Which is why the New Mutants debuted in Marvel Graphic Novel issue 4. Now, like most spin-offs, there has to be something new, different, and exciting to make it new, different, and exciting from its predecessor. And what did that for the New Mutants was the depictions of teenage life, like the hardships and growing pains a teenager has. There was also an element of mysticism, aka religious experiences during an alternate state of consciousness. What I'm saying is the New Mutants were definitely ahead of their time, especially with exploring stuff like this for teenagers and not adults. Basically, the early New Mutant stories were more science fiction and fantasy based than your stereotypical X-Men story, which says a lot. They basically became superhero coming of age stories. I mean, the stories dealt with demonic dimensions, alternate futures, and an ancient Roman civilization that was hidden within an Amazon rainforest. And like I just briefly talked about in their origins, the New Mutants also came across the Hellfire Club, which was a secret society. This also led to a rivalry with the Hellfire Club's young apprentices called the Hellions. The Hellions were basically Emma Frost's version of the New Mutants. She wanted to get all the younger mutant talent to herself before Xavier did to shape them into mutants much like herself and Inner Circle. The original team consisted of Thunderbird, now Warpath, Cat's Eye, Empath, Jetstream, Roulette, and Tarot. But like all superhero teams in comics, the roster is constantly changing, and there's no exception for the New Mutants. After the apparent death of New Mutants leader Karma, co-leaders Cannonball and Danny Moonstar recruited Cypher, who was able to read and speak any language rapidly, whether it's human, alien, or machine, essentially making him an unmatched computer expert. Then you have Magic, Colossus' sister. Everyone pretty much knows who she is. She became a really popular character. Anyway, she's a mystic who can open teleportation discs, allowing her to travel to Limbo, and from there, any point on Earth. Then you have Magma, who has the ability to control lava, and then there's Warlock, an extraterrestrial techno-organic alien. Warlock can basically construct his body into any form he wants, and he's considered a mutant because he can experience emotions. Anyway, by the time 1986 would come around, Professor X was written out of the New Mutants series. However, before he left, he made Magneto the head of his school. That's right, one of X-Men's biggest villains became in charge of Xavier's school. And not only was he the new headmaster, he was the longest running headmaster, staying in that position from New Mutants issue 35 through 75. Magneto was incredibly protective over his students, especially after the events of the Mutant Massacre and the Fall of the Mutants. This made Magneto incredibly uptight, setting rules for the New Mutants that they would eventually break in order to help out their friends and people in need. Writer Chris Claremont would eventually leave the New Mutants and take on Wolverine and Excalibur. The series was then handed over to writer Louise Simonson. During this run, Magma was written out of the book and Magic was de-aged to childhood. Then due to the unpopularity of Cypher, he was killed off in New Mutants issue 60. Around this time, Simonson would also take several members from the Exterminators, a group of young wards from X Factor, and have them join the New Mutants. These characters would include Boom Boom, a teenage girl who can create plasma bombs, Fire Fist, a pyrokinetic, Skids, who can create force fields around her body, and Richter, who can make shockwaves. Then in 1989, the New Mutants would journey to Asgard. The story had Danny Moonstar written out of the series, becoming a Valkyrie. But I will say the most controversial issue from this run was from New Mutants issue 64, titled Instant Replay. Essentially, the mutants were mourning Cypher's death so much that the book included a scene where Warlock attempted to resurrect Cypher by taking his corpse out of his coffin and then showing it to Cypher's loved ones. Because of this, a lot of readers were complaining it was too morbid. Sales starting to drop over the years eventually led to my era of the New Mutants from the 90s when Rob Liefeld joined the book. This is where fan favorite character and new mentor of the group, Cable, was introduced. Then over the next year or so, a bunch of longtime team members of the New Mutants were either killed off or written out. Because of some tension with Liefeld and Simonson eventually left the book with issue 97. It's at this point writer Fabian Nicieza would be brought on to write dialogue for the New Mutants. Then in New Mutants issue 98, the very next issue, they created one of the most popular Marvel characters of all time, Deadpool. This era of the New Mutants consisted of Domino, Cable, Feral, Shatterstar, and Warpath. But by 1991, the New Mutants was canceled with issue 100, and Cable went on to lead a new team similar to the New Mutants called X-Force. But that's for another episode, my friends. Skipping some stuff here and there brings us to the most current iteration of the New Mutants, which is Jonathan Hickman's 2019 New Mutants title. This series brings back classic New Mutants characters like Sunspot, Wolfsbane, Mirage, Magic, and Cypher, and it adds some new friends like Chamber and Mondo. But there you have it, friends. So now it's time for powers and abilities. As I always say when doing history of episodes on teams, the powers and abilities range drastically as there's several members to a team and the roster is constantly changing. But let's run through some briefly, like Mirage, aka Daniel Moonstar, who can create visual empathic three-dimensional illusions like I mentioned earlier. But it's not all rainbows and fun because she has the Demon Bear, who was originally an entity who haunted her dreams and was seemingly responsible for the deaths of her parents. Then you have Cannonball with the ability to generate thermal kinetic energy and use it to propel himself through the air. You have Karma, who can mentally possess people's bodies, Sunspot, who has super strength fueled by sunlight, and Wolfsbane, who can transform into a wolf. But it doesn't end there. Then you have Magic, who can make teleportation discs and pretty much travel anywhere. There's also Warpath, who has super speed and super strength. And then of course characters like Boom Boom, Skids, and Fire Fist, who have crazy powers, which I talked about a little bit earlier. What I'm saying is the New Mutants' powers and abilities are essentially limitless, as they're comprised of a revolving door of mutants. Definitely a hero team you do not want to mess with. As for reading recommendations, there's a bunch, but here's several of my favorites. You have New Mutants Epic Collection Renewal, New Mutants Epic Collection Curse of the Valkyries, New Mutants Demon Bear, New Mutants Classic Volume 1, New Mutants Classic Volume 2, and New Mutants by Jonathan Hickman, Volume 1. There's way more, but I think that's enough to get you guys started. First up for the week of August 25th, we have The Flash issue 760. After years of manipulation, the Reverse Flash has finally destroyed the Flash family. But they aren't going down without a fight as they race together to save the soul of Barry Allen. Now we have Spawn issue 309. The mysterious and dangerous army of Spawn continues to grow. First She-Spawn and now Reaper, the medieval Spawn. I've been a Spawn fan since I was a kid, and this is some cool stuff right here. Here we have Batman Beyond issue 46. Mr. Zero's plan is a success as weather around the world gets worse and a new ice age begins. We see Gotham City covered in a mountain of snow and ice, and the rest of the world isn't much better. And finally, we have Batman 3 Jokers issue 1. That's right, the Batman 3 Jokers story is finally here. And let me tell you guys, issue 1 is amazing. We actually just shot an episode on it, which is coming out very shortly, so keep your eyes out for that. And that brings another episode of Variant to a close. But if you liked today's video, be sure to check out this X-Men video right here. And if you like our channel in general, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. It always helps us out. But I will see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.